Podcast.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and it is the second week. Well, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's like the third, no, it's the 13th. Either way, it's the second. Already off to an auspicious start. And this, in real time, as I'm recording this, is not even 2025 yet. But my podcast microphone arm that swiveled on my desk that I could just plop my microphone down in front of my face, it broke. And I don't know who did it. I'm not accusing anybody of doing it, but it broke because it's got erectile dysfunction for microphone. It just flops down now. It's not erect. It's not stiff. And I need a stiff arm. And so it's gone now, and I got to hold my microphone up to my mouth now like an amateur, like a sad little amateur. And it's frustrating, but it's not the end of the world. It's white people problems. It is first world 1%er white people problems. I got to hold my own microphone. Oh, my God. What a sad, sad life I live. Anyway, this week, we are going and looking at some lesser-known stories from the Civil War era. And I say Civil War era because I do have one story here that took place during the Civil War, but I don't think it was actually related to the Civil War itself. But it still happened during that time while the Civil War was going on. And we're going to cover it as well here. So 4 stories of the Shelton Laurel Massacre, the Sand Creek Massacre, John Sedgwick, and our first story will be of Wilmer McLean.
Story time. Story time. Story time? Story time.
Wilmer McLean was a simple grocery store owner. Probably more like a general store owner, but, he's a grocer. He was living in Manassas, Virginia, when the Civil War broke out. Manassas, one of the hottest battle points in the Civil War. And on July 21st, 1861, Union and Confederate forces clashed at the First Battle of Bull Run, which was the first major battle of the Civil War. And that battlefield basically was on McLean's farmland. And even worse, Union soldiers during this battle fired artillery at McLean's house because it was being used as Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard's headquarters. Who was for the South. One cannonball even fell through the kitchen into the fireplace, which disrupted General Beauregard's dinner. I don't know why I gave him a British accent. Right, did I say, boys, they're going down the Union fighters is firing cannonballs as I'm trying to enjoy my dinner. For my name is P.G.T. Beauregard. And I am a Confederate Brigadier General, and I'm just trying to enjoy my dinner in this harmless little farmhouse that I have commandeered, while all of the rest of my men are dying on the battlefield. Anyway, it's kind of it's almost like a cross between Bill Cosby and a Southern plantation owner, which is very ironic. Anyway, so seeing as his house was completely occupied by soldiers and was getting pretty mostly destroyed, McLean moved 120 miles south near Appomattox, Virginia. And because he was deeper into Confederate territory, he kind of figured that the new location would provide a little bit more protection from the battles that were more so taking place closer to the border between the Union and the Confederacy, kind of along that Mason-Dixon line. It also allowed him to continue working as a sugar broker for the Confederate Army, since there was a smaller Union presence the farther south he went, and he wasn't going to run into any issues getting arrested or anything like that. Now, we're going to stop here for Wilmer McLean's story, and we're going to pick this back up later on in the episode, and you'll see why later on. But basically, at this point in 1861, his house has been taken over by the Confederates, been destroyed by the Union, and he's moved south to continue kind of working and making a living. So, fast forwarding, along through the war, salt became a very scarce commodity in the South, especially in the isolated mountain communities. It was even harder for Union sympathizers and Confederate deserters in the South to obtain items like salt, because no one was going to give something to people that they considered part of the enemy. However, in January of 1863, a group of Union sympathizers, fearing for their families' well-being, got together and decided that they needed to find a way to get supplies before they ran out. So they armed themselves and raided salt stores in the town of Marshall, North Carolina. Marshall, famously now destroyed by Hurricane Helene, probably will get built back up, but all of the water washed it away, most of it. It's crazy. Along the way, as they are raiding the town of Marshall, they looted several homes, including that of Colonel Lawrence Allen. General William Davis, who was stationed in the town of Hot Springs, which is a few miles down the river, he heard about the attack and dispatched a small militia led by Lieutenant Colonel James A. Keith to the Shelton Laurel Valley, where the looters were believed to be hiding. When the two sides met, 12 looters were killed and several more were captured. Governor Zebulon Vance, who was the governor of North Carolina at the time, upon hearing of this conflict, sent Attorney General Augustus Merryman to monitor the situation and try to curb the violence, because it's like, boys, we got the whole Civil War going on. We can't be fighting little incels and ourselves down here. We got to concentrate fighting on the war, not these little skirmishes and infighting inside our own lands. That's probably how he talked. Well, believing that this group of Union sympathizers was actually bigger than it really was, James Keith continued to search the valley and actually ended up killing 8 more Union sympathizers, Union soldiers who had been hiding in the woods while waiting for Colonel Allen and his men to actually get there and join him in the hunt. Eventually, Keith's forces converged on the home of Bill Shelton, where over 50 riflemen were hiding out. Battle ensued, and by the end of this gunfight, 6 more people had died. The rest of the men hiding with Bill Shelton fled into other parts of the valley. By the time Colonel Allen arrived to join Keith's forces, Allen's 2 children had recently died of scarlet fever after losing their medical supplies because of the looting. And so he's pretty pissed. And instead of trying to get information on the whereabouts of the looters in kind of a more diplomatic way, as you would hope a general or a colonel would do, Allen lost his mind, which is understandable, honestly. He rounded up all of the women and children in the valley and started torturing them for information. His men whipped and hanged 85-year-old Eunice Riddle, 3 other women, including, quote, an idiotic girl. You know what that means. They were hanged while others were beaten with hickory branches until blood literally was just pouring down their backs. Allen's soldiers then burned down the homes and slaughtered all of the livestock in the valley. When all of that did not get them the answers they were looking for, because those people probably didn't know, Keith decided to march a group of 15 captured men over towards Tennessee. But when 2 of the captives actually escaped, Keith abandoned that idea and started taking the other 13 men into the woods. He lined 5 of them up to start, shot them execution style, and then dumped their bodies in a trench. One of those first 5 actually survived the first round and had to be shot a second time. After this execution, another group of 5 was taken out of the line and forced to kneel in front of Keith's army to be executed. 60-year-old Joe Woods kneels before Keith, and he's like, "For God's sake, men, if you're going to murder us, give us at least a time to pray." And then Keith was like, "There ain't no time for praying." These are direct quotes, more or less. And then he just ordered his soldiers to shoot. One of his soldiers, however, hesitated, and when he did, Keith threatened to replace the soldier with one of the captives and shoot him instead. Again, 5 more shots rang out. One of the 5 survived, which, it's probably got to be the same guy who's just bad at shooting people. But David Shelton actually survived. He was the 13-year-old son of Bill Shelton. David, he's got his gunshot wound. He's bleeding out. And he's like, "You have killed my old father and my 3 brothers. You have shot me in both arms. I forgive you all this. I can get well with my crippled arms now. Let me go home to my mothers and sisters." Most of that is a direct quote. Keith, he was taken with compassion and sympathy with all this. And he, in a change of heart, said, "All right, get up, go home. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about all this." No, actually, he ordered his men to shoot David 8 more times, which I think is the literal definition of overkill. When Attorney General Merriman, who clearly had not done a good job of preventing things from getting out of hand, found out about this specific incident, he reported it to Governor Vance, who immediately ordered an investigation and recommended murder charges for both Allen and Keith. The surviving Shelton family members soon found their relatives' bodies being eaten by wild pigs and moved them to a cemetery. Just the crazy amount of carnage going on. You're already in a civil war, right? You already probably have a ton of family members who have died. And now you have really close family members who've just been executed by, honestly, people on your side. You were kind of sympathizing for the Union, maybe, or maybe you just weren't fighting, or maybe you had deserted the Confederate side. You just weren't fighting in the war. And so these Confederate soldiers just show up and massacre your entire family because you kind of were looting, which granted, don't loot for supplies. That's kind of a bad thing to do. But, anyway, James Keith actually ended up spending 2 years in prison while awaiting trial, but escaped 2 days before the Supreme Court ended up clearing him of all charges. He was never recaptured, and North Carolina never ended up rearresting him. They gave up the search for him 2 years later. Allen, for his role in it, was only given a 6 months leave from the Army. Moving on now to the story of John Sedgwick, who was born on September 13th, 1813 in Cornwall, Connecticut. His uncle was a general who served with George Washington during the Revolutionary War, which pretty much meant that Sedgwick's life would center all around military service. After graduating from the United States Military Academy in 1837, Sedgwick went on to serve in the Seminole Wars, the Mexican-American War, the Utah War, and the Indian Wars. So that's his life. He is just a war dude. Well, when the Civil War broke out, Sedgwick had already achieved the rank of colonel and was the assistant inspector general of the government's military department. Although he missed the first battles of the war thanks to cholera that he probably got from one of the other wars that he was fighting out there, he was assigned to a brigade that fought in Yorktown and Seven Pines. After being wounded in the 7 days battles near Richmond, Virginia, Sedgwick was then promoted to Major General. So following his recovery from his wounds at Richmond, Sedgwick and his Union were thrown into the Battle of Antietam up against Stonewall Jackson. Thanks to a complete lack of preparation from Commander Edwin V. Sumner, Sedgwick's troops were completely routed and forced to retreat with just half of the number of men that it entered with. So his whole unit gets massacred basically. On the way he was retreating, Sedgwick was actually shot 3 times and was forced out of action until late 1862. So once he gets back into the war in 1862, he spends the next year facing Confederate troops in Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and Salem Church, all without much luck. He's just losing battle after battle. His unit eventually joined other Union troops at the Battle of Gettysburg, though most of his troops were used as reserves to fill in gaps that had previously been blown up by Confederates. His troops ultimately became a major contributor in the Second Battle of Rappahannock Station after they captured 1,700 prisoners. Well, By the spring of 1864, Sedgwick had lost favor with the higher-ups in the Union Army, mainly because he really wasn't as passionate about abolishing slavery as other commanders. He was really more passionate about states' rights. That's more of an inside joke than anything. George Meade, who had led the Union troops to victory in Gettysburg, decided to reorganize the Union Army and demote several underperforming generals. Sedgwick, who at this point was really tired of war because it's been his entire life up to this point, actually was hoping that he would be one of those who was getting reassigned and demoted and hopefully go to a part of the South that wasn't constantly fighting. Instead, he maintained his regiment and was actually sent to the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. So, on May 9th, 1864, Sedgwick was directing artillery placements on the left side of the Confederate defenses while all Confederate sharpshooters 1,000 yards away were sniping at them. So basically, they're all out in the open, right? And because that's how battles used to be won. You just find a big wide open field and you shoot at each other. So he's kind of directing his men where to place their artillery. Confederate snipers are 1,000 yards away on the other side of the field. They're shooting at him constantly. Sedgwick, he's pretty much over it at this point. And he's just kind of prancing among his soldiers on his horse. Bullets are whizzing past him. Meanwhile, his troops are scared out of their mind. They are ducking and dodging every time they hear a gunshot because they don't know. They hear bullets whizzing by them. They don't know how close it is. Meanwhile, Sedgwick's just like, yes, man, punches. No, he probably doesn't have a southern accent. He's for the North. Whatever. He's just like, yeah, I'll put your artillery over here. I don't know what accent it is. I'm giving up. Anyway, Sedgwick... So, he's kind of being a dick at this point, or he just doesn't care. And, he's like, what? Men dodging this way for single bullets? What are you guys going to do when they open fire along the whole line? That was a direct quote. Still, Sedgwick's men, they're kind of ignoring him like he's crazy because they're continuing to flinch and duck with each gunshot that rings out. Sedgwick immediately goes, why are you dodging like this? They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. Again. Direct quote. And at that moment, as soon as he finished that sentence, he was shot in the face by a sniper bullet and died, obviously. He was the highest ranking Union soldier to die in the war because he was being a dick. He's like, come on. These guys couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. Splat! Oh, well, they didn't have to hit an elephant. They just had to hit your face. And they did. So that was John Sedgwick's story. Moving on now. So this is the story I was telling you about that's not technically part of the Civil War. But again, like I've talked about this before where it's like, I grew up thinking that like when a major war was going on, like that's the only thing that was going on. Like, during the Civil War, I just kind of imagined everyone dropped what they were doing and they were just all off at war, other than like the women and children who were like staying behind to like raise the children and take care of them, and then the children would grow up enough and then they'd go join the war. Or like the women would kind of be there caring for the soldiers. Same thing in like, I'm pretty sure I just scratched my beard into this microphone, which I wouldn't have had to do if my arm was still working. Anyway, like World War I or World War II, I just thought that like all of the men, or at least like all of the men that were drafted, just left and went to the war. And then like everyone that was back home just kind of like did war related things. That's not how it goes at all. Like it's just a thing that's happening in the world, anytime like I look at how like the Ukraine Russia situation is going on, or like all the stuff going on in the Middle East, like, no, like life is just going on as normal, but like sometimes you have to dodge a building that's collapsing because it just got bombed, or like, oh, well, we can't go to school now because it got destroyed by a bomb because the Russians bombed it last night. It's just like it's just a ton of like huge inconveniences that happen now, but life is still going on. Like you still got to go to work, which God would suck so bad, right? Like I just imagine, like say, another civil war or something breaks out here, right? And like I got to still commute to the office every day, but I got to go through like 3 checkpoints to make sure that like I'm driving on the correct sides roads, because Charlotte is now a conflict zone, and I'm looking up in the skyline and like some skyscrapers got windows blown out of them because they've been bombed, or buildings have been destroyed, whatever the case is, right? And it's just funny, because then I'm still going to work. Like, I'm still going to go to Chick-fil-A for lunch, even though there's like, cat's got the poop zoomies. Anyway, but even though there's just like tanks driving along the road beside me, like, just like a regiment of Proud Boys just walking down the street with their AK-47s. Just like, anyway, it's just that almost seems less logical to me than just thinking of everyone going off to work. Anyway, all of that is to say that during the Civil War, there was still stuff going on in other parts of the country. So to kind of back up a little bit, following the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851, the United States formally recognized that the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes held huge swaths of lands between the North Platte and Missouri rivers in what is modern-day Nebraska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. But then when gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains, all of that basically went out the window as immigrants from the east flooded into the area. So again, it was just that kind of pattern where it's like the United States would sign this treaty with the natives, say, hey, look, you guys have all this land. We promise we're not going to do anything with this. You guys can totally have it because it sucks. And you guys, like, this is yours. All right. We're at peace now. Right. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, they found gold there. All right, we're coming back in. Look, we called no backsies. We lied. All right. Sorry. So we're going to do this now. We're going to take this part of the land. You guys can go over here though. Like, you can definitely have this land. We don't need it. But we're going to come in and take this one. We're going to let people come in and live there. Right. So this pattern kept repeating itself a lot. So territorial officials again met with native tribes once gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains, and they drafted the Treaty of Fort Wise, which somehow got the Cheyenne and Arapaho to cede a ton of land to the United States, basically leaving them only with a small reservation in eastern Colorado that was roughly 1/12 of the size of what had been negotiated in the Treaty of Fort Laramie. So the Dog Soldiers, who were this band of Cheyenne and Lakota soldiers, were outraged by their tribal chiefs who had agreed to such a horrible deal and actually refused to abide by this new treaty. So by 1864, the Cheyennes were aggressively attacking, looting, and killing white settlers in western Kansas and eastern Colorado, all while refusing to meet with government officials to work out a new deal, which honestly would have likely ended up with them losing the rest of their land, because that's how these deals seemed to go back then. On April 13th, 1864, a group of Cheyennes and Arapahoes drove off 60 oxen and 12 horses and mules from a herdsman camping near Denver. When a small group of soldiers went to repossess the livestock, the natives attacked them and killed 4 of them. A month later, the 1st Colorado Regiment, led by Lieutenant George Ayer, approached a group of Cheyenne camping near Ash Creek. A native soldier named Lean Bear, who had previously met with President Abraham Lincoln and received a peace medal and a document signed by Lincoln stating that he was a peaceful Indian, which, God, you had to get a certificate of peace. So, like, you just present your certificate. Oh, I am a peaceful Indian. That feels a little too patronizing. Did I cross a line there? Did I cross a line? No, it's fine. Anyway, it's crazy to me that like natives had to get certificates of peace and show that they were a peaceful Indian. It's also crazy to me that Colorado was a thing during the Civil War, even before the Civil War, which makes sense, right? Like California was a thing then, right? Because of the 1849 gold rush and 49ers and whatnot, right? Anyway, you just don't think about it. Or at least I don't. However, as Lieutenant George Ayer was working under orders to shoot all natives in his path, he shot Lean Bear off of his horse before the other soldiers all shot him to death as they rode past. So, Lieutenant George Eyre, he shoots Lean Bear. Shouldn't have shot Lean Bear. Lean Bear was a peaceful. He was a peaceful. All right. President Lincoln even gave him a certificate, met him in person, was like, yeah, this guy's peaceful. He's one of the good ones. Not like one of them scalpers out there that we got to shoot, right, boys? No, he was a peaceful one. But Eyre, he doesn't care. He's under orders to shoot all of them. And so he does. And then in retaliation, the natives shoot Eyre to death. Throughout the summer, white settlers continued to be attacked and raided. Women and children were captured, raped, sold, tortured, killed. At least 32 attacks were recorded, with 96 settlers being killed. Although Colorado Governor John Evans attempted to make peace with the area tribes, the Cheyenne went to Denver in September and informed John Evans that peace was 100% out of the question. We are tired of your shenanigans, white man. We're taking our land back, which, great, good for them. By the end of the month, Governor Evans mostly rescinded his peace offering, even though hundreds of natives who didn't get the no peace memo were already en route to Fort Lyon near Big Sandy Creek, where they had been told they would be welcomed and supplied by United States troops. So a lot of miscommunication going on here, right? Like, you've got the Colorado governor who was like, yeah, come on, let's make peace. No, you don't want peace? All right, then there's no peace. But meanwhile, there are United States, there are federal troops out there who are still thinking, oh, okay, like some of these are peaceful. Like, we want to try to work together. Like, if they need help, we've got supplies for them. Like, come on over here to Fort Lyon. We'll help you out. Well, in November of 1864, 600 Cheyenne were turned away from the fort, even though over 600 Arapaho had already been taken in. Once everyone was in place at Sand Creek, which was obviously close to Fort Lyon, Colonel John Chivington, who had been ordering everyone to kill all of the natives, arrived at the encampment with 425 men. Obviously, this is the point in the story where things get pretty bad, as if, they haven't been really bad already. On November 29th, Chivington ordered his men to attack the fort, despite Chief Blackkettle flying a U.S. flag with another white flag tied beneath it. And we all know white flag means surrender. Like, that's how you communicated back in the day that you were surrendered, because you had flags. But despite that, Chivington's men didn't just shoot people. They brutally massacred these natives. Women and children were hacked to pieces, scalped to the point that their brains fell out of their heads. And that's according to eyewitness testimony. Robert Bent, a soldier who witnessed this attack, said he watched a United States soldier go up to a woman, broke both of her arms with his saber, and just left her to die. He saw another woman who had been formerly pregnant, had her child ripped out of her stomach, and was just lying with it bleeding out. Another group of soldiers came across a 3-year-old child walking through the sand behind a retreating group of Cheyenne. The American soldiers jumped off their horses roughly 75 yards away, and each took turns trying to just pick this child out, like snipe this child, before the third soldier finally shot him dead. Soldiers would then cut off ears, fingers, and noses of native people. One warrior had his testicles cut off so that U.S. troops could use it as a tobacco pouch, which is gross. The ball sack, not the actual balls themselves. You get it. The natives, who had not brought their weapons to Fort Lyon because they thought everything was going to be peaceful, had really no way of fighting back. Numbers based on eyewitness testimony kind of differ to the total number of people killed during the attack, but it's somewhere between like 70 and 600, which is a big range. Most of whom were women and children who had stayed behind in the fort while the warriors fled to try to go and get their weapons. Only 24 U.S. troops were killed, and most of that was due to friendly fire from drunken soldiers who were just ready to shoot some people. After the attack, General Chivington and his men returned to the fort to loot the area. Anyone who had survived the initial attack was then killed and scalped, with soldiers taking scalps of women, children, and infants. Chivington's men also took other body part souvenirs, including fetuses and female genitals, that they publicly displayed at saloons at the Apollo Hall in Denver. USA, USA, USA. Oh, God, it's so bad. Although the survivors of the attack worked together to then lead retaliatory attacks on white settlers in the area, nothing was really ever carried out on the same scale as the massacre at Sand Creek. The massacre was initially painted as a big victory against a huge band of natives because propaganda. But as stories and eyewitness accounts surfaced as to what actually happened, people realized like this was not the United States' finest moment. Despite those testimonies, including that of Silas Soule, who was murdered a few weeks after speaking out, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of War recommended that no one be charged for their actions, which is wild. Like to rip a dude's balls off and not be charged with a crime is crazy. Among the other things that happened, that was like, I chose that one because it's like kind of comical to think about on paper. Like, unlike some of the other things that I've already mentioned, that's like, how do you not charge someone for that? Anyway, once all of this was out in the open, the U.S. government then met with surviving members of the tribes and drafted the Treaty of the Little Arkansas, which gave them free access to land south of the Arkansas River and promised additional land and cash reparations for the descendants of the victims. Of course, this was all nullified 2 years later and replaced with the Medicine Lodge Treaty, which of course completely screwed over the tribes by reducing their reservation land by 90% and instead gave them the worst parts of Oklahoma, which at first seemed like was most of Oklahoma, and then they found oil there, but later on the Osage kind of took advantage of that and actually benefited from all of that. Anyway, to wrap things back up in the Civil War, right? Remember our first story of Wilmer McLean. 4 years after he was forced to move south after the First Battle of Bull Run took place on his farmland, on April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee was preparing to surrender to General Ulysses S. Grant and sent a messenger to Appomattox to find a place to meet. The messenger knocked on McLean's door and requested the use of his home, which he had since returned to, because he could kind of tell the war was going over. The fighting was kind of going on in different places. He could return home and start, making repairs to his house. McLean, he's like, all right, fine. He reluctantly agrees. And so inside Wilmer McLean's parlor, Lee and Grant signed the surrender and ended the Civil War. Once the ceremony ended, members of the Army of the Potomac actually began taking furniture and other items in the house that weren't fixed to the floor as souvenirs. They're just stealing stuff out of this guy's house. Because, this is where the Civil War ended. I've got the rocking chair from the house where the Civil War ended. Despite McLean's protest, considering all of his belongings were being confiscated, one man threw some money at him and continued on. It's like, hey, come on. Don't take my silverware. Fine. Here's a quarter. Get some new ones. One item, the table on which Grant drafted the surrender order, was taken for $20, which is basically roughly $320 today, and was carried off by George Armstrong Custer of Custer's Last Stand fame, which is crazy, right? Like, it's a crazy connection, right? It's just George Custer didn't really steal it, but he takes Wilmer McLean's table where the Civil War surrender draft was written on for $20. And then he goes and gets massacred at his little last stand by the end. You get it. That table actually is now on display at the American History Museum at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., if you ever want to go visit it. 2 years later, McLean ended up selling the home and moved to another place in Manassas. McLean said, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." And yeah, it did. All right, there you go. Some lesser known stories from the Civil War in the books. One thing that we definitely, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's recap and see what we learned.
What did we learn?
Number one, no one really won the Civil War. Like, yes, the South surrendered to the North, and on paper, the South lost the Civil War. But if you look at the Sand Creek Massacre, like the U.S. troops, those are basically Union troops. All right, it's U.S. federal troops, and the Union was the federal government, and they were just doing all kinds of nasty stuff out in Colorado to the natives, which is just wild. Because and that's why I think a lot of that gets forgotten, because the Civil War was going on, and so everybody was kind of focusing on that. Meanwhile, Union troops are out in Colorado scalping babies and stuff. Like, it's crazy. Number two, the Civil War literally started and ended. Maybe not literally started, but like the first major battle and the last major moment happened on the same property in Virginia. So that's it. There's not a third one today.
What did we learn?
Next week on Our Weird World, we got stories of some wonderful weirdos, some eccentrics, as they were called back in the day, which today they'd be called autistic. So we're gonna look at the stories of Timothy Dexter, John Murray Spear, and Emperor Norton, because you ever listen to your old grandparents who are just like, well, back in my day, we didn't have all these homosexuals and autistics running around. Yeah, you did. You just called them by different names. And so we're going to look at some probably 1,000% autistic dudes next week. It's going to be a fun episode because they were hilarious. So that's it. Thanks so much for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird.
This is a podcast.